Radhe Radhe, a spiritual good morning to one and all. Mummy and I are here to present in today's video some information regarding a term and a few phrases and context that come up often in commentary or other descriptions for a few Bhagavad Gita verses and in our spiritual journeys in general.
Radhe Radhe.
That concept that we're talking about is a reference to something known as the chariot. And I'm curious to know where that comes from. So, Mummy, do you have any information on where this chariot reference or maybe the spiritual analogy comes from?
Yes, Gagan, this comes from Kathopanishad. And let me give you a couple of shlokas regarding this description. So the first one is Atmanam rathitam vidhi shariram rathamevatu buddhim tu sarathim vidhi manah pragrahamevacha indriyani hayanahuhu Vishayamsteshu gocharan Atmendriyam manoyuktam Bhokte tyahurmanishinaha.
That's helpful to get us started, but do you have a little bit more information, Mummy?
Yes, we can go through another two shlokas.
Okay.
Yastva vijnanavan bhavatya yuktena manasa sada tasyendriyani vashyani dushtashrava iva sarathe yastu vijnanavan bhavati yuktena manasa sada tasyendriyani vashyani sadashrava iva sarathe.
Okay, that helps. I think I got a little bit of that. But before we proceed, maybe you can help summarize a few words or list out a few words that are important here. I could catch a few, but you might know some of them and a creative way to remember any of them.
Okay, so let's go through 5 important words. The very first important word is Atmanam. Atmanam means the self. Then another important word is Rath. Rath means the chariot. And then Sarithim. Sarathim means the charioteer. Then another group is Buddhim. Buddhim means the intellect. Manaha. Manaha means the mind. And a very important word is Indriyani. Indriyani means the senses.
All right. Thank you, Mummy. So I think you had groups of the words there as 1, 2, and 3 so that we can try to remember them in their separate groups. Now, let's actually get into the elaboration and explanation in English of this entire chariot reference that we're talking about. So we've heard a few shlokas from the Kathopanishad, and now we're going to look at the following. Some of you might remember, others, maybe it's the first time, but as I mentioned, there are certain verses of the Bhagavad Gita, specifically chapter 3, verses 27 and 43. We had covered these sometime back in 2021. And then today in class, we covered chapter 4, verse 36. And what's common to each of these 3 verses is that Swamiji's explanation talks about this reference of the chariot that we keep on mentioning. And again, we've now seen that it comes from the Kathopanishad. And so now in terms of trying to understand all of that, those 4 shlokas and more of the Kathopanishad, let's look at this through an exercise. So as we said, time to test yourself. The next slide that we shall reveal contains an image of a chariot and its various components, so that's in quotes, along with question marks, items that need to be identified. Please try to replace the question marks with suitable words or phrases to denote your understanding of how the chariot comprehensively represents a spiritual analogy. Again, for those who know Sanskrit and were able to understand the 4 shlokas Mummy recited, you might already know a lot of the answers, but we'll assume there are a lot of beginners as well and people not familiar with Sanskrit. So we shall develop all that one by one. So let's see what that image is and hopefully not get too confounded by that. Whoa, okay. Lots of colors, lots of question marks there, lots to fill in, but we'll try to understand this. And before getting into attempting the answers, we shall first look at 2.5 minutes or so of a video by Swamiji.
How many kinds of desires are there? Predominantly 5 kinds. The desire to taste, to smell, to see, to touch, and to hear. God has given us 5 senses, and we seek the objects of these 5 senses. And the whole world is a subject of our senses. But how dangerous are these desires? Kuranga matanga patanga bhringa meena hata pancha bhireva pancha eka pramadi sakathanna hanyate yasevate pancha bhireva pancha. The elephant desired touch of the female elephant. The hunter placed the she-elephant in a trap, and the male elephant was ensnared to its death. The deer loves sweet melodious sound. The hunter starts the melody. The deer is enchanted to it and is shot. The fish was trapped by its desire for taste. The insect was attracted by sight to the fire and got burned to death. The bee was enticed by the aroma. It sat on the lotus, and in the evening as the lotus was closing, its attachment prevented it from flying away until it got trapped in the flower. An elephant came by, broke the lotus, ate it, and the bee met its death. These creatures are dying because of the desire of one of their senses. Yasevate pancha bhireva pancha. What will happen to those humans who indulge in the gratification of all their 5 senses?
So hopefully an eye-opening video there that, as I said, will help us answer some of the responses here that we need as question marks on the image, but of course not the entire chariot reference. So now let's start working on these one by one. We are trying to look for a title for this image. So that's this first question mark here, and that is known as the parable of the chariot, or Rath Kalpana. So a set of images, or in this case, one image, a visual that provides a reference as well as a story and some moral meaning, something like a fable. So it's known as the parable of the chariot. So that's a suitable title in English. Likewise, in Sanskrit or Hindi, it is Rath Kalpana. Now, the next one, we're going to focus on these horses. And if you count them, there are 5 of them. And the hint given, of course, is in the video itself. Desires come from our senses. Therefore, you might imagine that each horse is a sense. Well, indeed, before that, we want to understand that this whole image of the chariot, it actually represents the body. So once we have that, then the first horse, it's representing smell, the sense of smell, which in the video was given with the example of the honeybee attracted to the flower. The second horse seems to be moving right here and touching, and that is the sense of touch. The example from the video was the elephant. Third one's looking high up, sight. So the sense of sight, which was given by the example of the moth seeking the light. Fourth one is the sense of taste. And that example was of the fish attracted by the fisherman's bait. And that, of course, was a desire it was seeking. And finally, after smell, touch, sight, and taste, we will have sound. And the example given there is the deer. Fun fact, not sure if many people might know this, but the way these are listed, if you look at these, the 5 senses, 3 are with S's, 2 are with T's. Maybe that helps keep all of them in mind. So that again is for the horses. Now we had question marks around here and in other spots as well. So now let's see what those are. Before that, we want to figure out where these horses are headed. So that arrow here is a hint. And if you look at it, they are obviously seeking the objects of the senses. All of our senses seek or desire the objects of their individual senses. So they're moving fast ahead, trying to get as much attraction to those. Now, coming back to this part of the image, we shall see that the reins are actually representing the mind. And if you notice the animation here, it was kind of bouncing. The mind gets swayed by the desires that the senses have. And if these senses, these horses, are not too tame, that's a good example of how we get carried away, attracted to the objects of the senses and not able to rein in the horses or rein in the senses. So this is again the mind. Now the next one is over here. If you look at the spinning feature here, this is the charioteer, which actually represents the intellect. Our intellect, if it's taken over or controlled by the mind and the senses, it gets bewildered, hence that spinning sort of example. And then finally, we have the passenger here, who is the soul. The animation representing that was to show that the soul in this case is asleep meaning ignorant of its true identity as the soul. Rather, there is a misidentification as the body, which then gets attracted by the objects of the senses. And in turn, the mind takes over the intellect and doesn't help the soul progress on its spiritual journey. In contrast, if we're able to have the soul make appropriate decisions and the intellect discerns amongst various thoughts that the mind creates, then we will not get swayed by our senses. So the final image, part of this, the visual, is this arrow representing the hierarchy of how these various senses are. The soul is higher than the intellect, is higher than the mind, and it's higher than the 5 senses. And we hope, of course, that we as the passenger here of this chariot, we're able to understand ourselves as a soul and progress on our individual spiritual journey. So once again, this is known as the parable of the chariot or Rath Kalpana. If you enjoyed this, hopefully, and learned something, please feel free to put comments below. And you're welcome to ask questions or put a comment or any kind of feedback. And hopefully, if you would like to learn more too, just a reminder for some people, as well as new information for others, is that Mommy and I regularly teach classes as part of our volunteering. So on Sundays, we both together conduct a class on Bhagavad Gita study. That's why I mentioned that in today's class, we covered chapter 4, verse 36. We try to go into detail and explain about 3 verses or so at a time. And then on Fridays, Mommy individually conducts a Bhagavad Gita recitation class. Mommy, can you just remind us what time that is? I know it's shown here also.
Yes, it is on Friday, 11 a.m. Dallas time, and Indian time is 10:30 p.m. at night. And we have just finished chapter 6, recitation of chapter 6, and we are doing revision of chapter 6.
Wonderful. Again, you're welcome to use this link here, which will also be posted in the description for this video below, and use that to get more information, or contact us as well through the comments if you have any questions or would like to know more. So once again, this was just a quick introduction with the reference to the Kathopanishad for something that we believe a lot of people have come across, which is the parable of the chariot. Thank you. Radhe Radhe.
Radhe Radhe.